I've always been the kind of person who prided myself on being independent. I've lived in this small town my whole life, where the days stretch out longer than they probably should, and everyone knows everyone else's business. Honestly, if you sneezed, you'd probably hear about it by dinner time. It's the kind of place where people greet you with hello, as if they just saw you 5 minutes ago, even if it's been years. But there's something comforting about that familiarity. It's like being wrapped in a warm, cozy blanket, one that's slightly too small and maybe a little scratchy, but it's home, you know? At 19, I felt like I had it all together. Sure, I didn't have everything figured out, but I was on track. I was in college, I had a part-time job at the local bookstore, where I might have read more books than I sold, but who's counting? And then there was my nephew, Hilary. Yes, you read that right, Hilary. He was 25, a little older than me, but we'd always had this strange, unshakable bond. I mean, he was my nephew, but at times, it felt like we were more like siblings, even though there was a 6-year age gap between us. He was more like a big brother than a nephew. We spent hours together, talking about everything and anything, sometimes in deep, philosophical discussions, other times in debates about whether pizza counted as a vegetable. I argued it did, but Hilary, being the reasonable one, didn't buy it. He was funny, smart, and had this way of looking at the world that made everything seem just a little bit brighter. It was no surprise that when life's little curveballs came our way, Hilary was the first person I'd call. People would often ask, "Are you two twins or something?" And we'd both laugh, mainly because we both knew we didn't look anything alike. I had dark hair, and Hilary had that messy, almost bedhead look that seemed to get him mistaken for a rock star more often than not. He had a grin that could light up the entire street, and his laugh, infectious. If you were having a bad day, just being around Hilary could turn it around. It was like he had a magical power to make things better, even if it was just by making you laugh at his terrible puns or his obsession with conspiracy theories. I swear, he believed the moon landing was a hoax, still does. But it wasn't just his humor or charm that made Hilary special to me. It was the fact that we shared a bond that was unique, even by small-town standards. Most people had their own lives to lead, but somehow, Hilary and I had a way of picking up right where we left off, no matter how much time had passed since we last saw each other. Our connection was as natural as breathing. If something happened to me, I knew he'd be the first one at my door with a bad joke and a homemade smoothie, which, for the record, never tasted as good as he made it sound. Sometimes, I would forget that he wasn't my brother. I'd walk into the living room, and there he'd be, lounging on the couch with his feet up, pretending to do work but mostly scrolling through social media. He'd grin and say, "Hey, what's up, sis?" And I'd roll my eyes, muttering something about how I wasn't his sister, but secretly, I didn't mind. We didn't need to be siblings by blood to understand each other on a deeper level. We were as close as two people could be, and I cherished that. Even though he was technically my nephew, he often acted more like the older sibling I never had. If I ever needed someone to talk to or someone to share an inside joke with, Hilary was my go-to guy. He wasn't just family, he was a friend, a confidant, and in many ways, a part of me that I couldn't imagine living without. But recently, something had changed. And it wasn't just that the weather had gotten warmer, or that the town had started buzzing with a new kind of energy. No, this was different. It was like Hilary, my ever-charming, easygoing nephew, had suddenly decided to switch gears and turn into someone. Well, someone I couldn't quite place. At first, I thought it was just me being overly dramatic, as I tend to do, especially on days when I've had way too much coffee and not enough sleep. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized something was definitely up. It started small. One evening, I was in the middle of a Netflix binge, one of those I'm just going to watch one episode kind of binges that somehow turns into an all-night affair, when Hilary knocked on my door. I had just finished a bag of chips, the family-sized kind, because why not? And I was in my usual state of post-snack bliss, sprawled out on the couch, wearing my oversized hoodie and looking like I hadn't seen a hairbrush in 3 days. "Hey, I brought you something," he said, standing in the doorway with a shy smile that was so Hilary-like it made me blink twice. He held out a small, neatly wrapped package. I raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" I asked, half expecting it to be some random gadget or one of those novelty items that you never really need but always end up with at family gift exchanges. Just something I thought you'd like, he said, holding the gift with a smile that seemed just a little too eager. It's a book. I know you love reading. I stared at him, blinking twice. A book? Really? I mean, it wasn't like I was complaining. I loved books. I was that person who had an entire shelf dedicated to my currently reading pile, which was also the books I haven't finished pile. So, naturally, I opened it right there in front of him. The cover was glossy and brightly colored, with a title that looked so romantic it could have been written by a unicorn. But as soon as I flipped it open to the first page, I froze. My brain didn't quite catch up with what I was seeing. I slowly skimmed the cover again. A love that shouldn't be, a nephew's forbidden desire. Wait. What? I blinked once more, just to make sure my eyes weren't deceiving me. But no, the words were right there, staring me down like some bizarre version of a family scandal waiting to happen. I looked up at him, who was standing there with that completely innocent look on his face, clearly unaware of the storm brewing in my head. I said slowly, this is an interesting choice. Really interesting. I tried to sound casual, but my voice came out more like I was on the verge of asking him if he just accidentally handed me a how-to guide for awkward family dinners. Yeah, I thought you might like it. You know, it's a really good story about, well, family bonds, he said, his eyes completely unblinking. I mean, I know you've been reading a lot of romance lately, and this one's pretty touching. Very, heartfelt. I said, trying not to laugh nervously. The awkwardness was settling in like a fog, and I wasn't sure how to clear it. I guess you could say it's heartfelt in a way, I added, hoping that somehow, the situation would magically make sense. It didn't. But this book is about a nephew falling in love with his family member. His grin didn't falter. Yeah, it's a little unusual, but you know, it's one of those things that really explores deep connections. It's not just about romance. It's about overcoming obstacles, forbidden feelings, and… I interrupted, holding up a hand. I get it. You know what? I'll read it. I'll definitely give it a try, I said, though I was pretty sure I might need to reevaluate our entire family dynamic after this. Thanks, I guess. I felt like I was in some twisted romantic comedy, where the awkwardness of the situation would eventually turn into a heartwarming story. But as I stared at the book in my hands, all I could think was, why did he think this was a good idea? Had he somehow mixed up the titles at the bookstore? Did he even read the back cover before buying it? What did he think this book was about? I mean, yes, I liked a good romance novel, but this? This was not what I had in mind when I was reading over a cup of tea. I glanced back at him, who was still watching me expectantly, like he just gifted me the most thoughtful thing in the world. There was no way I could tell him the truth about my growing discomfort without making things even weirder. Yeah, so, thanks for the book, I managed to say, forcing a smile. I'll, definitely dive into this unique family love story soon. Great, he beamed. I knew you'd love it. And with that, he left the room, completely unaware that I was holding what felt like the most awkward book I'd ever received, and, in that moment, wondering if I had somehow just entered an alternate universe where everything about this interaction was off. The next few days, things got even stranger. He would pop into my room unexpectedly, sometimes just to ask if I needed help with something random, like changing the light bulb or rearranging my bookshelves, which, let's be honest, were a disaster. But it was the little things that started to stand out. He would leave a bottle of my favorite tea on my desk when I'd mentioned I was out of it the other day. Or one morning, I found a blanket folded neatly at the end of my bed with a note that read, "You're probably freezing your toes off at night, so here's an extra layer." Toonday. I mean, who does that? Who brings blankets to their aunt's room in the middle of a heatwave? It wasn't that I didn't appreciate it, because I did. I was grateful, of course. But it made me feel like I was starring in some weird rom-com where the guy turns out to be secretly in love with the heroine, except, you know, the guy in this scenario was my nephew, and I was definitely not the heroine. It didn't stop there. One day, I found him standing in the doorway of my room, holding a takeaway box with my favorite food from the local diner. "I got you lunch," he said, grinning. "I know you've been too busy to go out, and I thought you might want a break." I took the box from him, half expecting it to be some weird, off-the-wall gesture, But no, it was exactly what I would have ordered. The perfect comfort food. Again, thoughtful, but way too personal. The problem was, I didn't know how to interpret all this kindness. Was I just being overly sensitive? Maybe he was just being a good nephew. Maybe he'd started paying more attention to me because I'd been stressed with school and work. Maybe this was just his way of showing he cared, but in a way that left me scratching my head. I wanted to tell myself I was reading too much into it, that I was just overthinking everything. But still, the more he did these things, these little, almost too thoughtful things, the more I felt like I was walking around in a haze, unsure of where the line between family and something else lay. The truth was, I wasn't sure how to feel about any of it, and that confused me even more. Was I supposed to just accept his gestures as the loving actions of a well-meaning nephew, or was there something else going on beneath the surface? I shook my head, trying to push away the thoughts swirling in my mind. But, no matter how hard I tried, it seemed like Tunde was surprising me more and more each day, and not always in ways I knew how to handle. The next day, he came by again. But this time, instead of bringing food or just dropping by, he handed me a beautifully wrapped gift. It wasn't my birthday, and there was no special occasion, so I was curious. "What's this?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Just a little something," he said with a mischievous grin. "Open it." I carefully peeled back the wrapping paper, revealing a beautiful necklace with a delicate pendant. It was a simple design, but the kind of thing I would have picked for myself if I had seen it in a store. "Wow, this is really beautiful," I said, touched by his gesture. "But why?" He shrugged again, his expression softening. "You deserve it. You've been doing so much, and I just wanted to show you that I appreciate you. You've always been there for me, and now I want to do the same for you." As I looked at the necklace, I felt a lump in my throat. I had always thought of him as my younger nephew, but this kindness, this attention, it made me rethink everything. Why was he being so attentive? Was this something more than just being family? One evening, after watching a movie together, he turned to me with a serious expression. "I know this might sound strange, but I've been thinking a lot lately," he said. I turned to face him, my heart beating a little faster. "What about?" "About us," he said quietly. "About how we've always been so close. I think I might feel something more than just family love for you. I've been trying to ignore it, but it's been hard. I don't want things to be awkward between us, but I also can't keep pretending I don't feel this way." I was stunned, speechless for a moment. "I don't know what to say. You're my nephew. I've always thought of you as family. I never saw you in that way." He looked down at the floor, his face flushed with embarrassment, like he had just blurted out something he shouldn't have. "I understand," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "I didn't want to make you uncomfortable. I had to say it." There was a long pause as his words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. I could feel the shift between us, the air growing thicker, like something had changed. Something I wasn't sure how to handle. He didn't look at me now, keeping his gaze firmly fixed on the ground, clearly trying to avoid my eyes. But what he just said, it was out there. He had feelings for me. And not just that, but he wanted us to take things further, cross a line that had always been clear in my mind. We're family. That was something I'd never questioned. But now, the lines weren't so obvious, and I didn't know where to go from here. I took a deep breath, my chest tight, as the words I needed to say got caught in my throat. It wasn't that I didn't care for Tunde, he was my nephew, yes, but over the years, he'd become someone I was close to. Someone who I respected. But what he was asking for, it felt wrong. He had always been there for me, and I had always looked out for him. Our bond had been built on family, respect, and shared experiences. So how could I look him in the eye now, knowing this was something that could tear everything apart? I didn't want to disappoint him, but I also knew I couldn't go down that path. "Hillary," I said softly, trying to keep my voice steady, "I care about you. You're like family to me." But this, I let the sentence hang in the air, unsure how to finish it. I didn't want to hurt him, but at the same time, I needed to be honest with myself. I can't." He nodded, his face turning even redder. He didn't speak for a long while, and I could feel the weight of what I'd just said hanging between us. "I didn't want to make you uncomfortable," he repeated, almost as if he was trying to convince himself more than me. I had to say it. I don't want to hide it anymore." I felt a pang of guilt. Here was my nephew, someone I'd known my entire life, sitting in front of me, vulnerable, exposed. He was asking for something that felt so foreign, so out of place. But how could I give him an answer that wouldn't change things forever? I couldn't simply ignore it, but I couldn't pretend I wasn't shaken by the weight of his feelings either. The silence stretched on between us like an uncomfortable, invisible barrier. I could see the sincerity in his eyes, the raw honesty that I knew took a lot of courage to express. But how could I respond? What did this even mean for us moving forward? Was this just a fleeting moment of confusion, something he'd come to realize was a passing feeling? Or was this something more serious? As much as I tried to rationalize it, part of me couldn't help but wonder if this was just the beginning of something that could become much more complicated than either of us could imagine. The idea of him as a romantic partner, it didn't sit right with me. But if I turned him down, would it destroy the relationship we'd always had? I tried to imagine what life would look like after this, with this conversation hanging over us like an unspoken truth. It felt like an impossible situation, one that I couldn't make sense of, and one I wasn't sure I could navigate without losing something I valued deeply, our bond. Hilary's voice broke the silence. "I'm sorry," he said, the words thick with regret. "I didn't mean to mess things up. I'll go." He stood up slowly, like he wasn't sure if he should stay or leave, his shoulders slumped as if the weight of the conversation had crushed him. "No, don't," I said quickly, reaching out to stop him, but I knew I couldn't change what had just happened. I wasn't sure what the next step was, but I couldn't let this end like this. Not without some kind of resolution. "I'm sorry too," I whispered, more to myself than to him. "I just need some time to think." And with that, he left. The door clicked shut behind him, and I sat there, my mind racing, my heart heavy. What did this mean for us? What did it mean for me? I didn't have the answers, not yet. But one thing was clear, things had changed. The air in the room felt different now, and the road ahead seemed foggy and uncertain. I wasn't sure how to navigate this new terrain, but I knew one thing for certain: whatever happened, I didn't want to lose the person Hilary had always been to me. Days passed, and things between us were a little awkward at first. We continued to see each other, but the dynamic had shifted. I was confused, torn between the love I had always felt for Tunde and the new feelings that were emerging. But as time went on, I realized that our bond was too strong to let one conversation destroy. I valued our relationship too much to let this awkwardness pull us apart. Finally, one evening, I decided to talk to him. We sat down together, and I took a deep breath. I began, "I know things have been strange lately, but I think we need to figure this out. You're family, and that will never change. But I don't think we can be anything more than that." He nodded, his expression one of sincere relief, like he'd been carrying a heavy burden and finally set it down. "I know. I understand now. I don't want to ruin what we have. I just needed to be honest with you." There was a long pause, and for a moment, the only sound in the room was the soft hum of the air conditioner, which, let's face it, was probably the real hero of this conversation. I let his words sink in. Hilary, my 25-year-old nephew, was standing here uncomfortable and vulnerable, talking about feelings I wasn't sure we should even be discussing. But he'd said it. He'd done it. And now, instead of running for the hills or diving into a million awkward explanations, I had to figure out how to handle this. I smiled, hoping it didn't look as forced as it felt. "I'm glad you told me," I said. "It's not easy to open up about stuff like that. Honestly, I'm proud of you for being honest, even though it definitely threw me for a loop." There was a beat of silence. He looked at me, still waiting, still unsure if I was going to suddenly turn into a therapist and ask about his childhood or, worse, start quoting random self-help books about emotional clarity. But no, I was just me, trying to process what had just happened, but also wanting to get back to the reality of us, family. "I hope we can just go back to being the close family we've always been," I added, feeling the weight lift off my shoulders, though there was still a small knot of confusion tucked away somewhere in my chest. It was a relief to know we could keep our relationship intact, and that this weird chapter would eventually fade into the background. Weeks went by, and things slowly settled into a more familiar rhythm. The awkwardness that had lingered between us started to melt away like the first warmth of spring after a long winter. Hilary and I returned to our usual routine, which, if I'm being honest, didn't involve anything as thrilling as deep conversations about forbidden emotions, but did involve a lot of spontaneous visits to each other's rooms, some casual banter, and the occasional, and very competitive, game of Scrabble. It felt like the bond we shared had deepened, but in a way that made more sense now. It wasn't the kind of deep where you start holding hands and exchanging deep glances, thankfully, no. It was the kind of deep where, after a real conversation about feelings, everything could just go back to being comfortable, familiar, and unshakably rooted in the love and respect we'd always had for each other. The surprises, like the random acts of kindness, the unexpected gifts, and the awkwardly thoughtful gestures, continued, but they no longer felt like something I had to analyze. They were just him, being the thoughtful, quirky nephew I'd always known. He'd go out of his way to grab my favorite snack from the corner store when he was out, or offer to help me with little things around the house, like reaching that one shelf in the kitchen I could never quite get to without having to climb on top of the counter. It wasn't that he had changed, he was still Hilary, the guy who could somehow make every situation feel like a comedy sketch. It was that I had changed. I had stopped looking at his actions through the lens of confusion and started appreciating them for what they were, small moments of thoughtfulness and care. Nothing more, nothing less. I realized, as time passed, that sometimes the most unexpected and uncomfortable moments in life could lead to growth. I had learned something new not just about Hilary, but about myself. I had learned that being open and honest, no matter how strange or awkward it felt at the time, could clear the air and let everything fall into place. And Hilary, well, he would always be my nephew. The boy who'd grown up in front of me, and the one who, despite his age, still managed to surprise me in ways I didn't expect. But now, he was someone I respected even more, someone I admired for his honesty and maturity. It wasn't always easy to handle, but it had made our relationship stronger, and I was thankful for that. Life in our little town had returned to normal, and so had our bond. The world outside might have been unpredictable, but in that small, quiet space we had carved out, I knew that we could weather whatever came next together, as family.